Today we are going to talk about your small moments story. We're going to move on to step 2, which is called the rough draft. This is where you're going to start writing your story. Go ahead and get out your important people and places list, your heart map, and your small moments story paper. These are always good to have out when you're writing, just to give you inspiration. If you remember, I decided that I'm going to write my story about the day that I climbed a volcano. Remember, you might have a really big and exciting event, or you might have a small event like going to the grocery store. You would be very surprised what an awesome story you could create with that. Last week we talked about creating a beginning, a middle, and an end. This was step 1 of the writing process where you pre-write. We decided in the beginning for me, I was going to talk about how we got to the volcano. We had to ride a bumpy truck, we saw a few wild joeys, and then we arrived to the top. In the middle, we actually climbed the volcano. There was ice towards the top of it, and then we went down inside the crater. At the end, the hike was over. We climbed back out of the crater, we took our final pictures, and then we left back in the bumpy truck to go home. So please get out whatever type of graphic organizer you filled out. You may have folded a paper into 3 sections, you may have printed this one out, or you may have just wrote it in your writer's notebook. Go ahead and find your beginning, middle, and end paper because you're going to need to use that today. Alrighty, now it's time to start writing your story. I'm going to show you today how I used this exact piece of paper that I filled out to help me write my entire story about hiking a volcano. This is the beginning of my story. I have my beginning part out so that I can see it whenever I write. I went to a country called New Zealand. One of the things I did there was hike a volcano. When it was finally time to do this activity, we had to ride in a very bumpy truck to get to the volcano. On the way, we saw baby joeys. It took a while, but we finally got to the top. Let's double check and make sure that everything I wrote makes sense with everything that I wrote in my organizer. The first thing was a bumpy truck ride, and I talked about that in my story. Next, there were seeing a few wild joeys. We also saw that. I wrote about the baby joeys. And last, I talked about arriving at the top. And there it is in my story. Do you see how I used this to help me write my actual rough draft? Let's move on to the middle of the story. In the middle, I wrote, the first thing we did was begin to climb up the volcano. When we got closer to the top, there was ice all over it because of how high in the sky it was. Next, we got to go down into the center. This is called the crater. It was pretty cool to see down where the explosions happen. Notice that I use my transition words. I use those words like first, next, after that. Be sure to use those in your story too. They're always great to have. Let's go over to my organizer and see if I used what I wrote. I first said that there was ice towards the top. And in the story, I also talked about ice. Next, I talked about going down inside the crater. And I talked about that in my story. Let's go to the end of my story. Finally, another transition word. We climbed back out of the crater and headed back towards the truck. When we got back up to the top, we took a few final pictures to remember all the fun we had. At the end of the day, we left in the bumpy truck to go home. At the end, I said I wanted to talk about climbing back out of the crater. And we did talk about that. I talked about taking final pictures in my story and leaving back in the bumpy truck to go back home. And there it is. Be sure that you check whenever you are writing that you are using your graphic organizer to talk about all the things you want to include. Now, you probably won't get to your ending today. I took a long time to write this before I shared it with you. It took me a few days. So don't feel like today you need to write the beginning, the middle, and the end. Today you may just want to focus on the beginning. Remember, your teacher is here to help you. We can't wait to see what you come up with. I know you're going to have an amazing small moment story. Don't forget, if you have a picture, that's a great thing to have out in front of you when you write. It'll help you get some more memories of what you did that day. Good luck, everybody, and enjoy your writing.